Let's start with this question that I'm frankly very, very seized with, namely the decision by the Obama administration formally to begin relations with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Tell us what your take is on the Brotherhood, its activities, and the likely implications of this action.
Well, first of all, the Muslim Brotherhood, and there is a consensus on this among all experts, those who are critical of the Muslim Brotherhood and those who represent the view of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the view is that the Muslim Brotherhood are the chief, most efficient, global Islamist Salafi network in modern times. It began in the mid-1920s. It's the cousin, quote-unquote, ideological cousin of the Wahhabis on the other side of the Red Sea. And most importantly is that they have 8 decades of experience in penetration, in urban organization, trying to take over in the region. So the first evaluation of the Muslim Brotherhood is not in the West. Actually, it's by anti-Islamist Muslim democratic elements who have struggled against the Muslim Brotherhood and today are very concerned that the Muslim Brotherhood may seize the opportunity to take over in Egypt, in Tunisia, possibly in Syria, partially in Libya, and establish a number of Islamist states. So for the Obama administration, for any U.S. administration, to claim that they want to partner, not just talk, but partner with the Muslim Brotherhood would be a monumental strategic mistake that would have huge consequences in geopolitics in the region for generations.
Yeah. Walid, you mentioned that there's a broad consensus. One of the dissenting voices, incredibly, as you know, back in February, was the top intelligence officer of the United States government, Jim Clapper, of the Director of National Intelligence, who described the Muslim Brotherhood as a, quote, largely secular organization that eschewed violence and was engaging in charitable works. From what you've just described, that doesn't sound remotely accurate. Could that basic misconception, in fact, naive, foolish assessment, possibly be guiding what the administration is doing at the moment?
First of all, I don't think this is a personal statement made by the top official of the administration. He sits on a mountain, a pyramid of advisors, opinions, and experts accredited with various layers of bureaucracies. But more important in this case is how strange it is. How strange it is that high-ranking officials, should it be in the intelligence community or in the diplomatic community, would make such statements, puzzling statements. Because as I said earlier, clarify, Muslim Brotherhood commentators and analysts, when we meet them in the Arab media, and I do that almost every day, they are very clear as to what the Muslim Brotherhood is. They are for Sharia, they are for the caliphate, they're proud about it. And then those who criticize them as well, whom we meet also in the media, they criticize them on the ground of these are anti-secular. So if in the Arab world and in the media in general, there is a consensus that this is who the Muslim Brotherhood are, you want to partner with them or not, that's a political choice. Why would the administration try to fool, quote unquote, the American public? I mean, this dissertation, this claim that the Muslim Brotherhood are just a loose coalition of secular groups who are doing, charity, this talk is not destined to the Arab world. It's destined to the American public, assuming that public doesn't know much about it. And that's sad.
Yeah, well, it's sad and it's dangerous in the extreme. Walid, let me drill down for another minute or two with you on Egypt. You, I know, played a prominent role last week in a very important conference of Christians from Egypt, folks known as Copts, who were very concerned about what is happening in their country, the prospect of, as you say, the accession to power of the Muslim Brotherhood, both for the Copts, for Egypt, for the region, and ultimately, I think, for us. Is there anything to the argument that we're hearing some make that the Muslim Brotherhood is fracturing in Egypt, that some are more moderate, that some are younger and seeking genuine, democratic outcomes from this Arab Spring? Or Are the Copts right that there's a world of trouble coming as a result of the ascendancy of what will ultimately prove to be a more monolithic brotherhood operation there?
Well, first of all, from the Copts themselves. And yes, last week there was a very important Coptic event, and thank you for being also an important component of that panel, warning about the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time. But Coptic intellectuals and analysts, and keep in mind that the Copts are the native population of Egypt, the pre-Arab, pre-Islamic Christian population of Egypt. There are 15 million people. But also not just the Copts, the liberal Muslims of Egypt, those who have begun the actual revolt, the young men and women with Facebook and laptop. I mean, this whole segment of modern Egyptian society, modernizing Egyptian society, is very clear when it tells us, both in the media or directly, that the Muslim Brotherhood are the Muslim Brotherhood, and they have had 8 decades of training as to do deception, strategic deception known in Arabic as Taqiyya, Taqiyya, meaning they will only show you one part of their agenda, meaning we are heading towards elections, so, naive West will think if they're heading towards election, it means that they are part of the political culture of democracy. That's wrong. National socialists and fascists, went to elections. The Islamist forces of Iran tried to establish some sort of elections. It's not enough. Basically, the Muslim Brotherhood are very centralized. They know how to outmaneuver, not just locally, but principally the West and its intellectual elite. So to answer your question quickly, the Muslim Brotherhood are heading in a very organized manner to try to seize the parliament, and if they do so, they will try to impose their laws, including Sharia laws, but other political mechanism that would basically weaken pluralism and weaken the moderates of Egypt.
And Walid, we were talking about Egypt. Before we turn to some of the other places where the Arab Spring may be foundering, let me ask you about a decision that was apparently made, or at least announced recently by the Obama administration, namely that it is prepared to sell a further 125 main battle tanks, the best in the American arsenal, the M1, to the new government of Egypt under management we know not yet. What is your sense of the advisability of that step and the use to which such tanks might ultimately be put?
Well, when we consider Egypt military and the alliance with the Egyptian military, it was under Mubarak when the joint strategies were to go against the jihadist terrorists on the one hand, contain the Libyan regime, Gaddafi, contain the Sudanese jihadist regime of Omar al-Bashir, and eventually, grant support to the Gulf if they are threatened by the Iranian regime. Now look what has happened since the fall of Mubarak. The ruling military council, which has some sort of shy but known partnership with the Muslim Brotherhood, number one and the more concerning issue, has allowed Iranian ships, military vessels, to cross the Suez Canal. So that's a gesture which is not basically telling us that the Egyptian military are going to be helping the Gulf states in containing Iran too. Although, the Libyan dictator has been targeted by NATO, the Egyptian military have refused to be part. They could have simply sent part of their army to pacify and take over from Gaddafi. They did not. Thirdly, despite the fact that there was a Darfur situation, despite the fact that Omar al-Bashir, has been declared as a war criminal, Egypt did not move against Omar al-Bashir. So that tells me that the increase of our military aid to Egypt will only be deployed on its eastern border against Israel, not maybe for a confrontation, but for a balance of power. So I would not recommend that this would happen because Egypt has enough forces to maintain its own national security. We've seen that. What the Egyptian Military Council ought to do now is to commit further to the United States that they are their strategic allies, first against Al-Qaeda, second to contain the Iranians, and making sure that no additional Iranian task forces are deployed in the Eastern Mediterranean through Egypt. So I would not recommend to add more power to Egypt before we get a democratic, really secular government in Egypt.
Yeah, amen to that. Wally, we're going to run out of time before we run out of topics with you. Let me quickly turn to one of the countries you've just mentioned, Libya. We've got the French, as I understand it, now saying that after all of this effort led largely by them, the U.S. leading from behind, of course, to depose Muammar Gaddafi. The French are now signaling that they're actually okay with him remaining in power. Where are we on this Libya business, and where do you think it winds up?
I don't think we're anywhere in the Libya business, with the exception of a World War I kind of a landscape. Not one force can dislodge the other without an international intervention, and international intervention on the ground is not possible now because of the U.S. hesitation, and as you said, because we want to lead from behind. The French want to ensure their oil interests, and that's important for them. But basically, at the end of the day, we have had, both in Washington and in Paris, a wrong assessment of the rebalance of power inside Libya, and we have had, more dangerously, a misassessment of who the rebel forces are, because there are two types within the rebel forces. You have the former bureaucrats, military, those with whom we could do business, but you have a very large segment, which we can see almost on Al Jazeera every day, of the Islamists, those who are of Muslim Brotherhood influence, and that is of great concern. So we don't have solid basis for partnership yet in Libya. We may have, but we don't have it now.
Yeah, worrying, to say the least. The precedent that many of us feared was going to be set by the response to what the administration and the United Nations has described as the responsibility to protect civilians seems not to be being applied in Syria. Tell us what is going on in Syria at the moment. I guess as far as the administration is concerned, they've taken a big step by saying that that Bashar Assad has lost his legitimacy. But are we likely to see a similar kind of intervention there? And in the absence of it, what is your estimate of what's going to happen in Syria? Walid Phares.
Well, very quickly, with regard to Syria, the reason for why the Obama administration was very slow in reacting to apparently a massacre of civilians, huge abuse of human rights in Syria by the Assad regime, is the commitment. Remember, for the last year and a half, 2 years, there have been Washington administration approaches for engagement with the Syrian regime. We sent an ambassador to Syria before they make any concession. And also keep in mind that this is a result of the Obama administration approach to Iran, Syria being an ally of Iran. So they are in a difficult situation in the sense that they have committed to Iran and Syria that they can sit down and talk with them and eventually talk with Hezbollah. And at the same time, the people of Syria is rising. So that's why they are watching what the masses are doing on the streets and then coming from behind again in Syria and support what has already become a fact, not leading it, but supporting it.
Walid, if you could very quickly tell us, do you think is the likelihood in the aftermath particularly of this extraordinary World Without Terror conference that the Iranians had, that the net effect of all of this turmoil, all of these changes of government or consolidation of power in the face of American inadequate leadership, may mean for the rise of Iran in the region and the detrimental effects that would have for our security interests?
Well, we could summarize it quickly as that the United States, under this administration, has engaged in what I call a global retreat, a general retreat. We can see it on all battlefields, all battlefronts. The Arab Spring came to basically as a surprise because we haven't seen in the estimates before 2011, probably except my book, and other good articles, but the government did not, this administration did not even project that there will be an Arab Spring. So they are now facing off ad hoc situation with situation and advance of Iranian influence through Iraq, through Syria, through Hezbollah in Lebanon, which just captured the government a few weeks ago. Iran is omnipresent in eastern Arabia, trying to make trouble to the Saudis. In northern Yemen with the Houthi revolt, Iran's regime has signed an agreement with the Eritrean authority to deploy naval vessels along those coasts and use their ports. Now they can cross the Suez Canal with the new change in Egypt. Iran is on the march. We are on the retreat.
Yeah. Not good for anything that we hold dear, that's for sure. Dr. Walid Phares is our guest, the author of now 10 books on a host of issues that bear on the subjects we're discussing with him, including future jihad, terrorist strategies against the West. Walid, let me just ask you quickly, one bit of relatively good news, I guess, in an otherwise pretty dark period and region is what happened in southern Sudan over the weekend. This was something I think you anticipated in your book, The Coming Revolution. Tell us what we should make of that, and whether it's in fact going to be all sweetness and light going forward for the Sudanese, at least in the south.
Absolutely. It's irony that while the United States and many of its good friends in the region are on the retreat in the sense of the democratic forces battling Iran, battling the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists, at the edges of that Middle East, in one we used to be a poorest nation, southern Sudan, and the one that struggled for 3 decades, was submitted to a genocide, a black population that was decimated by the millions by a jihadi regime. They finally reached the other side. They crossed the Red Sea, quote unquote, and now they live in freedom. They are independent. So our congratulations to our friends in southern Sudan, and hope that they will lead the freedom from their corner of the woods.
Certainly by example. Walid Phares, we have to leave it at that. Thank you for joining us.